Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor Jessica Flanigan, and we're going to talk about the ethics of sex work. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
How do you define sex work?
So I'm defining sex work as any kind of voluntary labor that people engage with that involves the provision of intimate services in exchange for money. And so by intimate services, it would just mean like things that we would generally classify as sex acts, so sexual performances or sexual encounters. So that would include both like pornography or also like certain kinds of like exotic dancing, as people would say sometimes, or just traditional sex work, which is the direct provision of sexual services. But also things like sex therapy could be classified as a kind of sex work as well.
Okay, so what's sex therapy?
So some people who are sex workers don't think of themselves primarily as entertainment or recreational sex workers, but therapeutic sex workers for people who have disabilities that impede their capacity to have a sexually intimate relationship, or people who need a kind of like rehabilitation to regain their sexual functioning. And so sex therapists are more within the kind of medical field, but they still could engage in what I would characterize as sex work because they're providing a service to enable somebody to achieve intimacy that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access.
So when you talk about the ethics of sex work, you have all of those different services in mind, correct?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty broad category, and it's a fuzzy category. So there's a lot of stuff that you might think of as sort of on the margins, like do we consider it sex work or not? So actors who do a sex scene for a movie, like to what extent is that pornography versus to what extent is that their craft, or people who pose nude for artists, or people who portray a kind of like sex act in the context of modern dance. You know, it's just a really like broad category. But the kind of sex work that I mostly focused on would be the direct provision of sexual services. So just like ordinary sex workers who meet up with people to have sex. But I think that the category in general is just much more expansive.
Yeah, and because it's so expansive, you would think that depending on the particular sex act in question, there would be different ethical issues involved.
For sure. Yeah. And that's why I really focus on the most controversial, which is the kind of sex work that's most widely prohibited, which is paying people for sexual services.
Okay. So what's your general position on that issue?
So I argue that the case for sex work has three different parts. The first is that it would be better for sex workers' well-being if it were fully decriminalized, if the government didn't regulate it all. So that's like one is like a well-being argument. The second kind of argument is people have rights to choose who to have sex with and what the terms are that they're having that sex. And so it's a freedom-based argument. It's just like that people have a right to decide on their intimate partners and also decide on their job. And so put those two rights together, and it's like you can decide to make your job the provision of intimate services. And then there's an egalitarian argument, which is that if you are going to prohibit sex work for the sake of, for example, promoting equality between men and women or preventing sexism or something, those egalitarian justifications for prohibiting sex work often are going to backfire. They're going to be much worse by the lights of a kind of egalitarian justice. So three different kinds of values that we think about in political philosophy as informing the ethics of how we regulate industries. All of those values, I think, on balance, are going to weigh in favor of letting people do sex work instead of prohibiting it. Now, there is a sort of like, also like a second layer. So there's like, just like there's three different kinds of moral arguments, all that support a right for people to do sex work being legally protected. But then the argument also has kind of two levels, which is in ideal theory, like if we had a world where everybody was sort of fully compliant with the law and they all respected the law, that in an ideal world, you would want to have the full decriminalization permission of sex work because you could just ensure that everybody who participated in sex work was capable of giving consent and it was a fully voluntary choice. And then we had just background conditions that were met through like a just distributive justice system or something like that. And then there's like in the non-ideal case, in the world that we're actually in, given the kinds of problems of what sometimes called like non-compliance, like given that, you know, the law isn't perfectly enforced, we don't have a fully just distributive justice property system or whatever. In that non-ideal context, you should also permit people to do sex work because it could be their best option in response to non-ideal circumstances. So at either level of idealization, when we're talking about political philosophy, I think that those moral reasons I talked about earlier are going to weigh in favor of allowing people to do sex work.
Okay, so let's kind of go over those three reasons again. The first one was a well-being argument, right? You're saying that overall it's going to be to the benefit of sex workers for sex work to be decriminalized.
To the benefit of people on balance. And
On
so
balance. Okay.
sex workers, but also their clients. So a lot of people who talk about sex work, they really underrate the moral significance of the services that the sex workers are providing to their clients. But a lot of people are lonely and they lack access to willing intimate partners unless they pay. And I think the sex workers are providing like a morally significant benefit to them as well.
And the second one is kind of like a deontological rights-based argument, right? People just have a right to decide what to do with their bodies. They have a right to decide what kind of job that they do. And you kind of put those two things together. It means that they have a right to do sex work.
That's right.
Okay. And the third one was what, the egalitarian argument? Can you elaborate on that?
So a lot of the people who think that sex work should be prohibited think that it should be prohibited because a society that allows sex work is a society that permits people to do things that are going to contribute to the subordination of women or are going to contribute to people viewing women as sex objects or the objectification of women. And that they think that if there's a society that has a lot of sex work, that is a symptom of a society that already has a lot of like really inegalitarian views towards women or where women lack equal economic opportunities. And so there's a kind of egalitarian case for regulating sex work, especially coming out of Europe. It's called sometimes the Nordic model, which is we shouldn't prohibit sex workers from selling sex, but we should prohibit sex buyers from purchasing sex because sex buyers are typically men. And when they are purchasing sex, they're doing it out of a kind of sexist attitude towards women. And then what they're doing is potentially a kind of domination of women. And then permitting that practice just perpetuates the subordination and domination of women on a larger scale throughout society. So that's kind of an egalitarian argument against my position. And so then the egalitarian argument that I have in favor of permitting sex work is to say, look, even if I were to grant in some ways that some people do view women as objects in these ways and that there is like economic subordination within that market, there's economic subordination in many markets, and prohibiting the markets isn't a justification, isn't justified on the basis of the fact that there's economic subordination because it doesn't replace that option with something better for people. It's just taking away another option for them. And we also overlook, when we talk about that argument, the subordination that people face with respect to the state. And so, you know, it's true in some ways that a lot of times people are only taking a certain job because that's their best option and they're, you know, they lack a lot of economic power, but for the fact that they're doing a particular job, that's true for all jobs. But that still is a more free interaction than the interactions that we have in a context with respect to us and our government. And so nobody's consenting to whatever laws the government is imposing on us in these ways. And so having public officials interfere at the level of those exchanges is also a kind of subordinating and dominating act, and that has to be weighed against it. And so when we have a public policy that says, oh, this female-coded labor is going to just be off the table for people in society, there's a way in which that's also inegalitarian because it's providing a targeted policy intervention that's limiting the rights and options of people who are doing a kind of female-coded labor paternalistically for their own benefit. And I think that that state paternalism towards women is also inegalitarian on feminist grounds. And so my response to the sort of egalitarian case against me, which is my co-author Lori Watson makes, is to say, look, even if you're right that there's some problematic attitudes that some people in the sex market display, it's also presumptively inegalitarian to have public officials paternalistically regulating this market on the grounds that they think that the choices that women are voluntarily making are bad for them. That's also potentially expressing a disrespectful view towards women, that they're not capable of making their own decisions, or subjecting them to domination by exposing them to them and their clients to interference by public officials just on the grounds that public officials disagree with the decisions they're making.
So the other part that you were mentioning was the distinction between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. And you were saying on both levels, there is a stronger reason to allow sex work. Okay.
Right.
And for the ideal theory, you were saying like, well, assume that we live in an ideal society where, people follow the laws. Perhaps we live in a world where we don't have sex trafficking or anything like that. And in that society, we should decriminalize sex work because it should be compared to just other forms of work?
Yeah. So take the ideal society where there's no force, fraud, and coercion in the market. Everybody's capable of giving consent. And also we have just background conditions. And so everybody has access to things like healthcare or a basic income so they can meet their basic needs. And so nobody's in a position where in order to satisfy their most urgent material needs, they need to do sex work. And it's a market where there's, laws about force, fraud, and coercion that everybody's complying with. Well, in that world, there would be, I think, no need to have a prohibitive regulation on sex work because we would have just background conditions that are met, thus ensuring that everybody who participates in the sex work market is doing so voluntarily, not because they need to meet their basic needs, and they're all complying with laws that require full consent for everybody involved. And so then I think if we really do have ideal background conditions, I don't think there's a need to limit women's options or men's options in terms of who they choose for their intimate partners and why. And so sometimes people will say well, in an ideal society, there would be no patriarchy. There'd be no gender injustice. There'd be no stigmatization of women. Sure, say that. Say that we have a fully gender egalitarian society as well. Again, then there's still going to be some kinds of labor that women or people with female bodies have a greater taste or talent to do, and just comparative advantage, you're going to see that labor market might sort by sex. But if there's no background gender-based inequality or hierarchy in our ideal society, however you want to define it, then there's no additional reason to regulate sex work in those cases as any kind of remedy, because sex work didn't emerge from any kind of background injustice because we just stipulated it's an ideal theory. Now in non-ideal theory, our actual world, then you have to think well, given that all of those conditions aren't met, how would we advance these values in practice? In the non-ideal case, the empirical literature regarding sex work in general is just really poor on both sides. So, people who are proponents of my position of full permission, of full legalization and decriminalization of the sex work industry will point to New Zealand, and they'll say look, in New Zealand, they treat sex work like any other regulated profession. That's the model that I would favor. It's fully decriminalized, and it seems like it's been a success in that society. So that's the kind of non-ideal theoretic case for, given where we are now, it would be better for sex workers if there was a legal market, because in the black market, it's more difficult for public officials to protect and monitor sex works, and to public health officials to intervene in that market for the sake of preventing contagious transmission. And so there's all of these kind of non-ideal reasons that bringing the market into the legal, formal economy would be beneficial to sex workers, sex buyers, and people more generally. And that's the best kind of non-ideal theoretic case for my position would be the New Zealand model. But then critics of my position will say, well, in non-ideal cases, in the actual world, if you allow a legal market in sex work, then you're going to expand just the size of the market for sex work more generally. And so once we normalize sex work more and we make it more accessible for people, they worry that, the legal market might expand, but then also the proportion of people who are in an illegal market or an unregulated market who are trafficked or not consenting or not capable of consenting, that's also going to expand. And you're going to have more people on net, even if it's just a small proportion of the market, more people on net who aren't fully voluntarily participating in the market. And so because we want to look out for those worst case scenario cases, that's a reason to just shrink the market as much as possible by prohibiting everybody from doing sex work so that we just don't have a large sex industry in our society. The problem with that non-ideal case for prohibition is that if you do have that, it does make it more difficult to enforce laws for those cases of people who are trafficked or non-consenting, because the whole market is then pushed into this like black market economy, which is like there's massive incentives for people to obscure their identities, for them to lie. It's like it's harder to track and monitor. And so even if you're worried about those cases, I still think for those cases, it's better to have a legal market more generally, and then law enforcement can focus their resources on that smaller minority of cases which are non-voluntary or non-consensual cases in the sex work industry for law enforcement.
Interesting. Okay. That was a lot there.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's fine. So like the impression that I'm getting is that you kind of lean libertarian. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've had discussions about this topic before, and I feel like there is a common strategy involved, which is the comparison between sex work and other types of work, right? At least from the pro side. And I think from the anti side, perhaps there's this fundamental assumption that that work is not comparable to other types of work. And I don't know exactly why that is, but my best guess is because it has to do with sex. And given the nature of that and just how we feel towards sex, it's something special. And so we have to put it in this special category and treat it with like, special gloves. Do you get that impression as well?
I do think that there's this view of sex as kind of linked up to a kind of sacredness. And so this is like many religious traditions will do this, where they think that marriage or like, the Christian family is very sacred. And so anything that's viewed as like a threat to marriage in the Christian family is viewed as profane in this way, because we have this like religious conception of sacredness. And so I think we see a lot of things like purity culture comes out of this, where, there's massive taboos against premarital sex because premarital sex is viewed as a threat to the kind of religious sacrament of marriage. And that's like a very kind of prominent view on the right, which is like strong taboos against any kind of sexual activity that's a threat to like religious conceptions of like the sacredness of the family or marriage. And then there's this other kind of strand, I would say on like the political left more prominently, that sort of takes that view of sex as being sacred, but then it's not for any reason related to the Christian family or religion or anything like that. But there's still a kind of like holdover about that. If I were to reconstruct like why I think that people more on the political left are viewing sex as sacred in that way, I think it might be because it is a domain of activity where there are going to be like highly gendered outcomes in that labor market just because of comparative advantages on taste and talent. So in general, sex buyers are going to be overrepresented as men. Like there's going to be way more men who are sex buyers. And in general, there's going to be way more women who are sex sellers, because there's just going to be a big market of sex buyers who are interested in paying for sex from women. And I think when people who are gender egalitarian in a certain way see that there's a very skewed gender-based distribution in an industry, that they kind of like view it as like a little bit suspect. And maybe that's like why they're bringing that in. But I kind of think there is this sort of like left-right coalition around the sacredness of sex where people want to kind of insulate it from the market on both sides.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description of what's going on here. I wonder if there's also this other element that has to do with just, I guess, your bodily autonomy and the intimacy that's intrinsically involved in sex acts.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I mean, this just might be me being American or something and having like internalized American values, but, I'm much more likely to do a job that doesn't involve sex. Right? Like it could be something really gross, like something I wouldn't want to do normally anyway. Right? But if I had the option, I would still rather do that.
Yeah, I do think that people, they themselves often want sex to have this like isolation from other parts of their lives, right? And they themselves want to hold it as a kind of sacred domain of activity. That's why we call it like intimate choices or intimate partnerships, right? It's like set away from your work and from your like other kinds of recreation. I think most people might have that preference, but not everybody does. And that's like a cool thing about the market, which is that it can sort of select for people who have a comparative advantage in not thinking about sex that way. And if they are a little bit different in their attitudes towards sex, then they could get a kind of market advantage for people relative to other people who would like to reserve that domain of activity and insulate it from the market. And you can imagine, I mean, there are other things like this where you might have thought, oh, it's like, it's so sacred, you can't take money for it. So for, in the original Hippocratic Oath, it says you can't take money for providing life-saving medical services. Like, that's your calling. But like now we're like, oh, you pay doctors all the time. Like, it's fine. And so we've had other types of things where we've like isolated it from the market, but that by isolating it from the market, you might have like limited the supply in the labor market of something that people really had a strong interest in. So imagine if we were to say, the family is so sacred, motherhood is so sacred, we shouldn't have daycare because, the bond between a mother and her child is like so important and sacred that at least for the first 2 years of life, those two, they should stay together. Now, I do think that motherhood is really sacred, and I think that it's like a really important, meaningful relationship. But people have other kinds of preferences, people have other kinds of values, and then that value might cut against other values. And so I'm not saying that you have to put your kid in daycare, but just having the option to have daycare, even if some people think that that's a very sacred relationship, if they think it's so sacred, don't put your kid in daycare. If other people disagree, then they can have access to it. I think about sex acts in that way as well, where like, yeah, like if you don't want that part of your life to be part of the market, don't do it. But that doesn't mean that you should call up your friends in Congress and have them prohibit everybody else from doing it.
Yeah. So what would you think about a case where a person asks for sex instead of cash for a service? Like, you're a lawyer and you can offer your services to people, but you're asking for sex instead of money.
I mean, I think that'd be very inefficient as a lawyer. So, I mean, people can ask for whatever, like payments in kind. You can say like barter work, like, oh, like fix my car or whatever. But the reason that we don't generally do that is because money is fungible in a way that like services and in-kind provision of goods is like not. And so it's just way more efficient to just put a monetary price on everything and do exchanges in that way. And so when people say things like, oh, well, I really worry that then, once we introduce sex work, that all of these market exchanges are going to have these like little like riders where there's like the provision of sexual services attached. Well, I don't think that's likely, because if you had legalized sex work, there would be a legal industry where people could pay for the provision of sexual services from a specialist, like an expert, a person who specializes in those services. So I don't think that they would ask for other employees to provide sexual services in those contexts, because there would be a legal market available for them to access sex work elsewhere. Like, that's what we see in New Zealand. It's not as if in New Zealand people start asking for payment in sexual services rather than in money. Instead, it's that people who are interested in paying for sexual services have a legal option that they can go to get them.
So then, do you think it's just an unjustified prejudice or bias that we have towards people? Like if I met a lawyer and then I, found out that he was asking for sex instead of money, like, I think I would judge that guy, like I would judge his character. I'd be like, there's something wrong with you, like you maybe like to exploit women or something. And that's not, and that's not okay. And I don't want to be your friend.
Yeah, I do think that like in labor agreements, that there are a kind of like, there's sort of implicit background of like, what are the goods contracted for in any labor agreement. And so if a person did want to have like a workplace labor agreement that like included sex work, that would have to be disclosed early on, because it is a kind of deal breaker for a lot of labor contracts for people. Like, people do not want to be sexually harassed at work. And so if they're going to, be exposed to that, I think that should be disclosed beforehand. And so if there was a lawyer, I'm imagining, who was like, has like a paralegal assistant or something, and was like, well, let me add into your labor contract that you should also provide sex work or something like that. So I've argued elsewhere, like, that would not be okay, but not because sex work shouldn't be allowed. That wouldn't be okay because she signed out to be a paralegal. And so like, if she'd wanted to be a sex worker, she would have gone into a different industry. You can't spring that on somebody. In the same way that it would be inappropriate for him to say to his paralegal, like, hey, can you babysit my kids on Tuesday nights, right? Like, that you would have to put that all at the kind of top of the job description, because implicit in what we think of as paralegal, she didn't realize that she was going to consent to that, and there's opportunity cost to taking a job. And so I agree that that would be kind of like not a great thing to do, but the reason that it wouldn't be great is because it's not good to fraudulently misrepresent labor agreements to people, right? And so it's like a different the location of the wrongfulness is at the failure of disclosure in the employment relationship, not in the fact that it includes sex work per se.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people would be troubled by that type of arrangement. And I think it might be because of these background assumptions about the importance of intimacy and perhaps the sacredness of intimacy. I don't know if sacredness is the right word, but there's something special about it, right? Whereas like your approach is saying, well, there's really nothing special about sex in and of itself or sex work in and of itself. So it really is comparable to other lines of work. So this kind of brings up the notion of exploitation. I think a lot of people feel like sex workers are exploited. And so I want to hear your response to that.
So what do we mean by exploitation? So exploitation is this word that people use a lot, but then when you really dial down and figure out like, well, what is exploitation? Like, what do we even mean by that? I think people have a hard time articulating exactly what the problem is. So like paradigm cases of exploitation are things like sweatshops, for example, where somebody has like very badly off, they don't have a lot of good options. And so they only choose to work in the sweatshop because given their background circumstances, they perceive that to be their best option. And then people will say, oh, the sweatshop owner is exploiting their bad fortune. You know, Nike shouldn't open a sweatshop in Indonesia because they're exploiting poor Indonesian people or something like that. Or, you know, Target shouldn't open a sweatshop in Bangladesh because Bangladesh, they're only working there for such a low wage because they're otherwise going to be at subsistence. So let's go with that definition of exploitation, which is that to exploit somebody is to enter into an exchange with them where you disproportionately benefit from the exchange only because they lack bargaining power because their other options are so poor. And their other options are so poor because of some kind of injustice against them. They can't meet their basic needs. They're in a really poor economy. There's some background conditions where it's not fair that they're in those difficult background circumstances, and you're getting a really good deal for that reason. That's what people think. So you want to go with that exploitation definition? Great. So say we take that definition, and then we're wondering, like, how should we morally evaluate the people who are exploiting? The sweatshop owner, the sex buyer. And my question is, who's worse in that situation? The exploiter or the bystander? So there's people who are like really, really poor, living on subsistence wages. Nobody's helping them. And then like the sweatshop owner walks in and is like, hey, I'm going to open a sweatshop here. I can double your daily wage by you working in the sweatshop. And there's a line of people that are like waiting to work there. And we say, oh, that's so exploitative. All those people are lining up only because the background conditions are so poor that this is their best option. But he's getting such a good deal because he's getting so much value out of this exchange and paying them nothing. Well, yeah, but like, what were you doing for those people? What was anybody else doing for them? Like, the exploiter is benefiting them more than anybody else. That's why there's a line out the door. So in the sex work case, people will say sometimes like, a lot of women are like really badly off. They're very economically precarious. They can't meet their basic needs or pay their rent. They're only turning to sex work because of some underlying economic deprivation. Okay, but what are you doing for those women? And so even if you think that it's wrong that a person is participating in a market where other people are only there just so that they can like meet their basic needs, if you're not helping them to meet their basic needs in any way and you're not replacing that option with anything else, prohibiting that option only is going to make them worse off. And also, there's not a real significant difference in terms of the exploitation of sex work relative to any other kind of work that is also targeting people who are only doing that work because otherwise they wouldn't be able to meet their basic needs, right? Like that example, like that concern about exploitation people bring up for sex work, it would just apply to all labor.
Yeah, that's something that I've concluded as well with others when we talk about exploitation, right? Like if you think about it, it's like we feel like almost all labor is exploitative. Therefore, we should be Marxist. You know, like I feel like that was kind of like the conclusion of a lot of my discussions with other people about the ethics of sex work. You know, it's like, well, if you condemn this, then you have to condemn all this other type of work too.
Right. And like, I think that there's some truth to that. Like, I think that the property system doesn't perfectly track people's natural entitlements to controlled resources. And that's like an issue in any kind of property system. So I think in general, a market economy is going to be the most conducive to well-being and the well-being of the worst off in particular, and it's the most free. But that doesn't mean that like a market economy is totally unproblematic. And I do think that public officials should enforce a property system that makes it so that as much as possible, people can meet their basic needs and that they aren't taking a job just because otherwise they'll suffer extreme material deprivation. So I'm not like so libertarian about property that I'm saying like, let people starve or whatever. But I think that the best way to make it so that people aren't starving and that the worst off are doing well is to have open markets, economic freedom for everybody. And then if there are still some people at the bottom who are so precarious that they can't meet their basic needs, that's a case for some kind of redistribution, but that doesn't mean that we should just like limit everybody's economic freedom out of concern for those people.
I wonder how much the ethics is informing the political philosophy. And what I mean by that is perhaps we have certain judgments toward people who exploit others. And because of those judgments, we think that there should be legal ramifications, right? That we should ban that type of exploitation or something. But perhaps the response is, well, it should remain in the realm of ethics, right? So let's say you're a factory owner in Indonesia, right? Maybe you should pay them better. Yeah, I don't know. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't know that you should, if you can, if there's going to be any trade-off between the number of people you employ and the wages you provide. So there is a trade-off there because, if you increase wages, it's usually because you are going to a facility which is like more productive machinery, and then you get more productive workers. And so sometimes paying high wages has substitution effects where then you're swapping out the people who are the workers you employ, and then the worst off workers who are like very low productivity workers. There's fewer of them who are employed, even though the average wage in your factory looks higher. So I actually don't think that it is wrong for the sweatshop worker, or if it's sweatshop owner, oftentimes I don't think it's wrong for them to provide a low wage, because I think that they're providing a low wage because they're employing people who are lower productivity workers. And if you had like a more technically complex factory or something, that it would change the demographic mix of who your workers are. And so, but I do feel like people have they have a set of heuristics in their head about like what the good kind of a person is versus like who the bad kind of a person is, right? And I do think that those heuristics lead them astray in these types of cases. And we definitely shouldn't think that those heuristics should be entrenched in the law. So like, even if you think that people shouldn't sell sex, people shouldn't pay for sex, that it's wrong in a sense, it doesn't follow that it should be prohibited legally, right? And I think that it's a hard thought for a lot of people to hold in their head, that just because you shouldn't do something, it doesn't follow that thing should be illegal. But
yeah,
of course,
yeah.
like you shouldn't cheat on your wife, but like also you shouldn't go to jail for adultery, I think.
Uh-huh. Do you think that type of reasoning, though, would also apply to things like a safe working environment or providing health insurance, right? Because maybe you say, well, there's a trade-off, right? It's cheaper for me to have an unsafe factory, maybe. And it's cheaper for me not to provide healthcare. So if my workers get hurt, well, that kind of sucks for them. I can just hire somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that in some cases, those types of provisions are also a violation of people's occupational freedom. So I think that all workers have a right to decide how to make trade-offs between risk versus wages. And so, for example, commercial fishing, super dangerous profession. People fall off the boat, they get cut, they die. It's awful. Like, it's very, very dangerous. But it pays a lot. And the reason it pays a lot is because the wage is compensating for the occupational risk. Football, like the NFL, right? That's awful, like on your body. But it made sense for Jason Kelce to stay in the NFL for a while, even though his knees are totally messed up and he got concussions and stuff, because it made him really rich and famous. And it was like a trade-off that he should have been allowed to make. Just like the commercial fishing people and the people in the NFL, I think all workers should have a right to decide how to make trade-offs when it comes to risk versus wages. And that when there's a kind of artificial standard of risk that is imposed by public officials, it prevents workers from making a trade-off that matches their own kinds of values. It imposes artificial caps on how much risk we can tolerate for people. And so I am against those kinds of regulations that prevent people from deciding their own risk tolerance. And then the healthcare thing, I came about this from forever ago about the Affordable Care Act. It's just weird to me that the person who's responsible for providing you with healthcare is your employer, because like your employer is giving you a wage. Like it's like they're already benefiting you in terms of like your ability to like meet your basic needs and like be healthy more than anybody else. And then public officials come in and they're like, well, instead of us collectivizing the cost of providing healthcare or allowing the market to provide healthcare, we're going to do this weird third thing where we like require your employer to provide you with healthcare, which is like the worst either way. And so it's like, I mean, I'm really against laws that require employers to provide people with healthcare for a variety of ways. It's like a huge market distortion, and it seems like it's like really unfair to disproportionately burden employers with this responsibility instead of either taxpayers more generally or the person who's purchasing the healthcare, the consumer of healthcare.
Yeah, so going back to the specialness of sex work, maybe there is a borderline case, like being a massage therapist, right? It's like it requires your body. It's not as intimate as sex, but you know, it's getting there, right? And everybody accepts that, you know, massage therapy is a legitimate occupation. Nobody thinks that it's like dirty. There's no like specialness attached to that, right? So for some reason, being a masseuse is comparable to being like a plumber, but being like a prostitute is totally not. And if you're a prostitute, that means somehow like you're being exploited or oppressed or something like that.
Well, that's the thing is like if you disaggregated everything that sex workers do, there's some other job that is doing the same thing. And so it's really just like the bundle of those things that people are objecting to. So we have like romance novelists who like provide people with like an erotic experience. We have dancers that do like a kind of like beautiful like erotic dance for people. Like that's permitted, and that's like a form of free speech in some places. You have marriage counselors, you have massage therapists, you have urologists and gynecologists who are like interacting with people's bodily fluids and like all of that stuff. Like whatever you're like the thing that that you have a hang up about when it comes to sex work, there's some aspect of that thing that someone else is doing somewhere else, right? But then when it comes to specific sex work, direct provision of sexual services, and you bundle all of those things together, then people are like, oh no, now we're over the line. But what is it? What's the one thing? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it really just has to do with bodily intimacy.
Yeah,
I think that's why it makes it special. And I can still kind of see it, you know, like it is intuitive to me. I can't fully justify it, but I feel like there is something there. Let's say that somebody, like some stranger, is, you know, standing very close to me.
yeah,
Right? That would make me uncomfortable. And I don't think that they should be doing that. Right? Now, let's say that person sticks their finger in my ear. Right? That's worse. They really should not be doing that. And like the longer they keep their finger in my ear, the worse it gets, right? And then they just, right, so you can just take it to the next level. So with each progressive step, it becomes more intimate and therefore becomes more of a violation of my, not bodily integrity, but somewhere in that realm.
totally. But the reason that you would think that is inappropriate is because you didn't consent to any of that.
But I feel like one is worse than the other.
Right. Well, somebody's standing very, very close to you. The kind of boundaries of like what you have a right to when it comes to like personal space in public, for example. So like if you're on the subway in New York, right, and someone's standing really close to you, it's like, well, yeah, like it's like everybody's standing really close. And I don't know that that's like, you know, you went there and you knew you forfeited a right to a kind of personal space by kind of getting on there in that way. Or
Yeah. I'm not imagining a public transportation scenario. I'm imagining where like they really don't have to stand close to me. I did not consent to it, and so like that's like really weird, and I feel like they're wronging me. But it's worse if they stick their finger in my ear, even though I didn't consent to either.
so I think the boundaries of like your bodily entitlement is like that's a super tricky like metaphysical border, and it might even be just determined by people's interests or by ethics or something. Like I don't know how we draw that line. But however we're drawing the line, I think sticking a finger in your ear, if you do consent to it, I think that just takes away anything that's bad about it. And so I agree that people are sort of like uncomfortable with violations that trespass the boundaries of the body in a way that they're not uncomfortable with violations like of property, for example. So if you assault somebody, we think that's like much more morally wrong than if you like steal their car, I guess, something like that. There's a sort of like vividness of the wrongfulness of a bodily violation. And I think that's justified. But whatever you think about that, the fact when people consent, I think that neutralizes it for all of them.
Yeah. So even if you thought that one was worse, the fact that somebody consents makes them all morally permissible.
Yeah, it's a kind of moral level playing field, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm wondering if it's this asymmetry that is being replicated in other areas of our intuitions. Like, for instance, like you talked about wronging somebody, like, like assaulting them versus like stealing something from them. Imagine a case where you assault somebody, or like be assault a child, and then another area where you like sexually assault a child. Like, I think generally we think sexual assault is worse. And I think it's because of the nature of sex. I don't know. What do you think?
Even then, the consent thing is the thing we should focus on. So in general, it's worse to kill somebody than it is to assault them. But people also have rights to die. And so if the person consents, they don't legally, but I think they ought to. And so if a person consents to end their life through medical aid and dying, even though killing is usually worse than assault, it's not wrong in that case. And so like similarly, surgery, we allow doctors to do things that would otherwise be monstrous forms of battery, but people consent to surgery. And so it's all right. Boxing, they consent to put themselves in a position where they're going to be assaulted when they get into the boxing ring. So there's all sorts of horrible things that you can do to things, and we can rank all of the things by horribleness. But consent is the balm that's going to like neutralize the moral wrongfulness of any of those things.
Yeah. I'm wondering like how far you take this kind of libertarian approach. So I'm thinking of different scenarios that opponents will likely lob at you. Let's say you have a rich person who likes to beat up people, and so he pays homeless people so that he can beat them up.
Yeah, this is the thing we said earlier about like, should our evaluation of a person's character determine what should be illegal? But at the point that you can pay somebody to be an NFL player, which is a person who's basically for a wage getting beaten up for entertainment purposes, and we can be an MMA, someone in mixed martial arts, for example, then yeah, I think that people can voluntarily take a job where they, get beat up for entertainment purposes.
Yeah. Okay. Dueling.
Yeah, I don't like it. And I think that it's like bad that there's these kinds of honor cultures that encourage dueling. And I think that we should like stigmatize it, discourage it. But it's your body. Really at the point that a person can end their life, I think that really does permit a lot in terms of the law. And the thing that you need to keep vivid in your head is you also don't consent to the law against it. And so like, even if you shouldn't be doing it, even if you think that it's, a really bad choice and that people shouldn't be consenting to do these things, if you think consent's really important, that same thought is also a reason to think that we should not have a law against it. So people will often look at these like bad choices and they're saying like, I feel like it's not fully voluntary. I don't know how much I'm a person who cares so much about consent, and I'm not totally sure about what the consent situation is in these cases because the person's very poor, or they have like other bad options, or we don't know how rational they're being when they sign up for these things. Sure. But if you're someone who really cares about consent and that's like making you squeamish about these kinds of toxic exchanges, then your caring about consent should also make you super squeamish about public officials interfering with those types of exchanges, because it's very clear that people aren't consenting to being subject to the law in those cases.
When you mean that people aren't consenting to be subject to the law, are you meaning that the people involved in that particular act are not consenting, or do you mean the wider society?
Nobody. Yeah. Like, when did you consent to any of these laws?
Oh, I see. So in order for somebody to consent to a particular law, they would have needed to vote for it, or no? Like, how do you consent to a law?
Yeah, good question. It's like,
isn't voting for it sufficient?
When did you vote for a law? Like, when did you vote for like any of these laws when did you vote for the law that says, maybe like referendums, but even then, like maybe you think that voting for something means that you personally consented to it. But take like a helmet law. Say that your state decides, oh, we're going to have a motorcycle helmet law. We'll vote for it. And this is like the best case scenario. They do like a direct referendum. And it's like, okay, then like 30% of people show up. And then among the 30% who showed up, a little more than half, so like 16% of the population voted for it. And they were like, yes, force us to wear motorcycle helmets. Well, there's like 84% of the population that never consented to it. And it's like, they're all going to be forced to wear motorcycle helmets now because like a minority of neurotic people decided that it would be really good to have public officials enforcing this paternalistic law. Like for almost all of these laws, nobody is consenting to them, and they're just imposed on us. And then the question is like, well, is the moral urgency of what we're preventing worth it for us to impose this law on everybody? If you think that to the extent that these things are consensual, that they're not morally problematic in the way that assault would be morally wrong, then no, it's not justified for public officials to enforce a prohibition because nobody consented to the prohibition and people are consenting to the exchanges.
I see. Okay. So then it sounds like what you're saying then is that there should be a default assumption for a lack of regulation because perhaps that's more freedom respecting. So any type of regulation that's passed has to be justified because it limits people's freedom.
I think that the criminal law should uphold people's enforceable rights. And I don't think that consensual exchanges or self-harming decisions violate people's enforceable rights. So it might be bad for people, right? Of course, like it's bad for you to ride a motorcycle without a helmet. You should wear a helmet. Honestly, you shouldn't be driving a motorcycle. If you are, stop, get a Volvo. But it's not like the government's place to tell you that. It's like you have a right to ride a motorcycle without a helmet, and you don't forfeit that right just because you happen to live in a place where people disapprove of that choice. And so a law that required you to wear a helmet would violate your enforceable rights. It wouldn't be upholding your enforceable rights. It would be violating your enforceable rights. You have a right to decide who to have sex with and what job to take. And like, it doesn't violate anybody's enforceable rights to make these consensual exchanges. And so the criminal law should have nothing to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. So going back to like this decriminalization aspect, is your argument that, or are you making a distinction between decriminalizing and legalizing?
Yeah. So in the sex work literature, people use decriminalize to talk about the New Zealand system, which is like, no, the criminal law has nothing to say about it. And then they'll say legalize to talk about like a more regulated system. And then there's a prohibition, which is like full prohibition. And there's kind of a spectrum there where you can increase regulation of the industry. And to the extent that you're increasing the regulation, you lose the benefits of decriminalization, and you introduce more of the harms of the black market, I think. And so some people will say like different parts of Europe will have highly regulated sex work, which is like very difficult for people to participate in because it's like licensed and very heavily monitored. The more you're regulating it, the more you're kind of introducing some of those harms of prohibition. But it's just a continuum. It's not like there's an either or. We have a lot of policy options between full decriminalization, where it's treated like massage therapy, versus full prohibition, where it's treated like, assault, right? And so along that continuum, I'm just saying we should get as close as possible to full decriminalization. But it's a trade-off, there's just trade-offs.
Yeah. Every time I hear discussions about the market and, regulation and the black market, there's always an assumption that the black market is bad.
So when sex work is prohibited, that provides incentives for people to conceal what they're doing. And so because there's incentives for people to conceal what they're doing, it's much harder for public officials to monitor those industries to make sure that everyone participating is capable of giving consent and is there voluntarily. And so it's kind of an instrumental case, which is just that if there's a legal market out in the sunshine, we can really address people who are there because of force, fraud, and coercion more easily, because those people will feel more comfortable going to public officials, going to the police, and then we'll have like more comfortable like pressing a legal claim against people who force them or trick them, things like that. Another issue is that it changes the mix of who's participating. And so if sex work is illegal, then people who are clients who have a very high risk tolerance and who are not that concerned about complying with the law, those are the people who are still going to be participating in the sex industry. And you're going to have fewer people who are participating in the sex industry just because they lack access to intimate services. Now, is that a majority of clients? No. I think most clients are still going to be people who just can't find anybody to have sex with them, and they're just looking for some kind of access to intimacy. And so I think that even in a black market, most clients are just going to be people who are like ordinary clients. But the proportion of clients who are potentially going to be indifferent to the law or, more risk accepting is going to be higher in a black market. And having a higher proportion of the clients is also going to be worse for sex workers. And so legalizing it and eliminating the black market or minimizing the black market is good for sex workers in those two ways. On the other hand, legalization will increase the size of the market, right? Because now the market doesn't have this legal penalty attached to it. And so you've lowered the price for people participating in the market. More people are going to enter into the market. So if you just hate sex work in general and you want to minimize the size of the market, then you might think like, oh, we should not legalize it because we want to impose a legal price on the market.
Interesting. What effects do you think this will have on sex trafficking?
Again, it's mixed. So if there's some proportion of people who are not participating in the sex industry voluntarily, even if you legalize sex work, if you also increase the size of the market, it's very unclear how those two dynamics are going to play off. So on one hand, you legalize sex work, and so it's much easier for you to ensure that people aren't trafficked and coerced within the market. On the other hand, the market just got a lot bigger. And so if some proportion of people in the market are trafficked and coerced, because there's like just a much bigger market, there could be, albeit a smaller proportion of the market, but a greater number of people who are trafficked and coerced. And that's really what the empirical debate about legalization is bringing up, is like, which way would it go? Like, we just don't, my read on the social sciences, we really do not know. It's very unclear. So you increase the size of the market, it's easier for you to prevent people from being coerced and trafficked. And so you might think like, oh, there's gonna be less trafficking, but also the market itself is much bigger. And so who knows how that trade-off is gonna get made. My own read of the social science is that on all sides, it's very bad. We just don't know. My intuition about this is that even if you think that this is a concern, there's also a scarcity of law enforcement resources. And so right now, if we have law enforcement devoted to shutting down voluntary consensual sex work, that is law enforcement that could have been used to address force, fraud, and coercion in the sex industry. And so whatever you think about how expanding the size of the market would change those types of dynamics, expanding the size of the market and getting law enforcement out of consensual sex work would free up resources for people to focus on crime. Another issue is how we define sex work or sex trafficking. So I'm defining sex trafficking, just for the sake of this, because I think this is the spirit of your question, as people who are sex workers who are not capable of giving consent. And so people who don't have the legal age or mental capacity to give consent, or people who are being coerced. So people who are being held against their will. A lot of people who are critical of legalizing and decriminalizing sex work define sex trafficking way more broadly. And so they'll say, for example, that a person is trafficked if they live with somebody who profits from the sale of their sex. So sexual services. So like a boyfriend in the home who profits from the sale of his girlfriend being a sex worker, he could be accused of trafficking her, for example, on that definition. But I think that definition doesn't really get at what people who are concerned about sex trafficking are really concerned about, because by the same light, say that there's a person whose girlfriend works at Starbucks, and so she contributes to rent and expenses with her paycheck from Starbucks. I wouldn't say that was labor trafficking. I wouldn't say that her boyfriend was forcing her to work at Starbucks just because he profited from the sale of her labor as a barista. And so I think that some definitions of sex trafficking are so expansive that they undermine the cause of addressing force, fraud, and coercion within the sex industry, because what's really going on is that activist groups who are concerned about sex trafficking sometimes also just oppose sex work full stop. And so they want like a very expansive definition of sex trafficking because they kind of want to characterize all sex work as trafficking. And some people will even say like all sex work is trafficking. Like no one would ever voluntarily choose to do sex work. But that's just not true empirically. People do voluntarily choose to do sex work. Just because you don't relate to that occupational decision doesn't mean that it's not a voluntary choice.
What if the data showed eventually that decriminalization did lead to a substantial expansion of what we consider to be, morally impermissible sex trafficking? Would that get you to change your mind?
I mean, it would be a consideration against it for sure, right? So when you're thinking about political philosophy, like what should we do in applied political context, it is empirically contingent because you're making these arguments based on empirical assumptions. And so if my empirical assumption were wrong, then I'd be like, well, that argument doesn't succeed anymore. I'd have to. Now, I still think that there's a freedom-based argument. And so say that legalization of sex work did lead to a higher quantity on net of forced fraud and coercion in sex markets. Does that mean that you should then go back to prohibition? Not clear to me. So for example, take an analogy to alcohol prohibition, like letting people drink alcohol, having more alcohol. Say that bringing back alcohol after prohibition did lead to a higher rate of like drunk driving or domestic violence, the kinds of things that people were concerned about when they supported prohibition. Would that mean then that because alcohol contributes to rates of domestic violence and drunk driving, that we should then go back to prohibition? Because it just turned out that prohibition was really good at preventing drunk driving and domestic violence. Not necessarily. It could just mean that we should allow for prohibition because there's still a large part of the alcohol market where people are enjoying alcohol safely, responsibly, and it would be really harmful to them to prohibit the whole market just because permitting the market led to a higher rate of crime and victimization for some people. Instead, you might think, oh, we should put way more public resources into preventing domestic violence and drunk driving now because in virtue of permitting people to drink alcohol, we have this huge problem on our hands of domestic violence and drunk driving. It wouldn't be a decisive reason to go back to prohibition, but it would be a consideration. Like one reason to prohibit alcohol is that when people drink, they kill people with their cars and they beat their wives. Like that is a good reason to prohibit alcohol. It's just not a decisive reason because you could address that problem in other ways that don't involve prohibition.
I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for talking to me about this. It's been fun. It's great.